Hello, welcome back and welcome to our first workshop today. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Sanath, who's an affiliate partner of Konoko. Unicom has a long-standing partnership with Konoko. We've been good friends as companies for many years. I've worked with Sanath's colleague Nick Melton. In fact, if you've attended our previous knowledge management conferences over the last year or so, you may have also heard Nick present as well. Uh, Delighted to welcome Sanath. A big welcome to you today.
Thank
And
you.
the topic today is on lean knowledge management, optimizing KM for immediate returns. So this is going to be about a 90-minute workshop, and there will be opportunity throughout for questions. And I think Sanath's leaving some time at the end for additional questions as well. So I will hand over to Sanath.
Absolutely. Thank you, Nick. And let me just share my screen right now.
That looks good.
So thank you for having me today. Good morning for some of you good afternoon. I think there might be one or two whom I have to wish good morning as well, right, Alex? So once again, welcome to this session. And we are here to talk about this wonderful subject, lean knowledge management, optimizing KM for immediate return. Just a quick introduction about myself. I've been a consultant, still a consultant, trainer, coach. Did my first work in KM in 2005. And in 2016, I was invited by Konoko and Nick Milton to represent Konoko in this part of the world, namely Malaysia and Singapore. It's been an exciting journey. We had the opportunity to impact a number of companies in one way or the other, whether it's the agile space that I'm in, or the knowledge management space, or the fusion of the two, which is going to be what we're talking about today. Now, given that this is a 90-minute session, I was thinking it's nice to have a bit of understanding of what we do together as a community. So I'm going to share a link in the chat, and this is going to be a link that I would like you to click on, and it will take you to a page. If you can see the link on your chat, does it come out for all? Okay, I'm just going to share my screen so you know what exactly to do. If you can click on that link, it should take you to a page that I'm going to share right now. Can I just have a check if anyone can get in? Okay, that's great. Ayushi, thank you. Alec, thank you. So I'm just going to show you what to do. You know, when you get to the page, you will see a plus sign on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And that's what you do. You click on that plus sign, you'll pop up little window. And all you do is to just type in where you live. So in my case, I'm based out of Kuala Lumpur. So I'm just going to put Kuala Lumpur there. And I'm going to just quickly just write my name so we know each other. And I'm just going to answer two quick questions. First and foremost, where do I come from? You could do the same. Okay, I see a lot of you coming in. So please remember, as much as you are clicking on your location, I would like you to put on your role. My role would be to spread awareness of lean KM. That's pretty much what I like to do. The challenges I face, if you could just edit your post, for some of you have posted, edit your post to indicate what are the challenges you face with regards to what you do at the moment. Okay, so I'm just putting mine. My role primarily is to spread awareness of Lean KM. It doesn't matter if you're not in that KM space, but all of us are in KM in one way or the other, right? So if you just could insert something that's pertinent to how you see yourself in the KM space and the challenge or challenges you face, just one of it will do. I'm just putting something there. All right, and you publish it, and there you go. You have something that's up. Okay, so I'm just looking at some colleagues that's joined us, Shreya, colleagues from West Bengal, Australia, Canberra, Siri. Okay, we've got from London. Okay, we've got some colleagues from Malaysia. Okay, more trickling in. Anyone still submitting, still publishing your answers? Not so much an answer, right? Just a bit more like an icebreaker, if you like. Okay, absolutely. Okay. Just to understand the feel, this is a global conference. It's nice to see people coming from every part of the world. India, Indonesia, we've got Australia, UK. I know we have colleagues from Philippines, Nepal tuning in as well, Pakistan. Brilliant. In the US. All right. Thank you for sharing. I'm just going to move on. We've got some colleagues who just entered associate in KM. Ayushi, thank you. Manila, yep, our first Manila post up here. Knowledge expert, challenge being siloed information. Absolutely. Thank you for sharing there, Jean. Okay, we've got someone from KL as well. Okay, challenge being to empower companies to elevate 95% of the workforce. Wow, that's interesting. Delhi. All right, I'm just going to stop share. Thank you so much for sharing in there. And let's pick up from where we left. All right, so I'm just going to, given that this is a workshop, a mini workshop, I would say, it's great if you could partake in a lot of little sharing sessions, chat what you can on the chat box. I know for some of you, this may be not new, but given that we are doing KM anyway, so feel free to add on to the body of knowledge any point. So yes, participate and have fun. Now I'm going to start with a short video. Okay, that's an interesting one. Now, I just want you to imagine this is the case of a typical KM program that you're in. And this connects, or rather resonates with the Knoko survey that we did a couple of years back. And the top most reason given is we have other priorities at the moment for not doing KM. So this is a reflection of the reason why organizations don't do KM. And the big question is, isn't KM a priority? Now, whether we like it or not, KM programs will be affected by this familiar term we call VUCA. The dynamics of the KM landscape today, with shifting priorities, the uncertainties that we see, the complexities that KM efforts bring in with competing stakeholders, KM programs at times, I would say, suffer from the lack of details from the onset. It makes it ambiguous. And these are just some of the challenges we face. Ladies and gentlemen, VUCA is not going to go away. The question is, are we prepared to look beyond? And as the saying goes, if we do what we've always done, we will get what we've always got. So therefore, something has to change. And that sets me quite nicely to what we want to talk about today, the subject of lean knowledge management, optimizing KM for immediate returns. Today, we will look at the thought process behind lean knowledge management. We'll start with that. And then we will examine lean knowledge management framework. And we will conclude by looking at an approach to implement lean knowledge management. And first things first, putting everything into perspective. Where is this body of knowledge coming from? Lean knowledge management. As the very word lean implies, you've got ideas coming from lean principle. You've got best practices of agility, and you also have knowledge management insights coming through. So if there is going to be a definition of what lean knowledge management is, I would say in Konoko, we define lean management when knowledge reaches the knowledge worker about just in time with minimal additional processing, cognitively speaking, and in a form where it can be applied immediately. That's pretty much the idea of lean anyway. So let's just set the context, the premise of the whole discussion today. Where are we coming from? Many companies, as you know it, some of you are very familiar with this idea of the Toyota production system. Many companies have reaped benefits from here. The whole method of making operations lean, and that's where the whole idea of lean is coming from. And to understand this a bit more, let me give you the context of something that's very familiar to all of us. For those of you who like coffee, let's talk about coffee. The supply chain process of coffee beans, if you know it, typically contains about 7 levels, from the process of the growing itself, the harvesting, the hulling, they call it, where the skin is removed from the coffee bean. A bit of science today, if you like. Drying and the packaging that's involved. And that's not all. The entire supply chain after the packaging is further extended through several intermediaries, including global transporters, you've got the exporters, before it gets to your retail shops and into your hands when you purchase it and bring it home. So that's a whole range of supply chain happening from the bean to the coffee, right? Well, that's not it. It comes to your home. You still have to make the coffee itself. We're still on coffee. What about the steps to brew coffee? And why am I saying this? Because if we start to understand this idea of value chain, you start to see the connection, the value that correlates from one to the other. And that brings me to what I'm going to tell you after in the context of KM. So typically, if you're making coffee, I don't quite make it this way, but apparently this is the right way. Step one would be to measure for your brew. And I'm going to ask you to tell me whether in your chat, now you can help me here in the chat, whether it's the doing or the knowing. Okay, I'm just going to help you here. Step one, measuring your brew ratio. And what that means is that you measure out coffee and water for how much you want to brew. For example, a typical 1:17 ratio for coffee to water would mean that your coffee is not too strong, right? So 1 ratio of water, sorry, 1 ratio of coffee and 17 ratio of water. Not too weak, it's about right. So, well, if you take about 42 grams of coffee, and that will mean about 700 grams of water, that will give you a nice, decent cup, not too strong. So will this be a doing or a knowing? Just waiting for a response here. Okay, I've got a doing coming up. We've got knowing. Well, there's a lot of knowing involved, but I think primarily this should be more so a doing. Roshan, I agree where you're coming from. It could well be a knowing because you got to know how to measure it, but the steps are pretty clear, right? If you're measuring it, and yes, you got to know how to measure it, and it's primarily the doing. Yes, I get the doing part as well. Absolutely. Ayushi and Roshan. Let's next move on to the step where you grind your coffee. You grind your coffee after determining how much coffee you want to brew. You grind it. Now, this gets a bit trickier because are you grinding it enough somewhere between medium grind consistency? Now, that's a little bit more than just a doing, right? Anyone? You got to do it for sure, else you won't have your coffee. But aside from doing, what else happens? Yeah, you've got the knowing, Shiria. Thank you. So you've got your doing and your knowing. Absolutely. Thank you. Next comes your stage where you boil. That's pretty straightforward. You boil and wait for 1 minute. That's pretty much a doing. What about place and wet the filter? And what happens here is that you're just doing that, right? You set the funnel aside, you place it, and you fold it to fit to the funnel. Depends what kind of machine you have at home. So pretty much the doing per se. And you place the coffee in the filter, pretty much the doing itself. And now comes the interesting part. Pour and wait. Now, the question is, the pouring fine is fine. What about the waiting part? It's the short pour. If it's freshly roasted, the coffee ground typically begins to bubble and foam. So you got to nicely see that there's a nice round head as the water saturates and the gases escape before you start to pour again and resume pouring. And it's about 30 to 45 seconds all in all that you slowly pour and get it right. So that seems like not just doing, right? There's a lot of knowing required. And then you complete your pour. And though that seems quite straightforward, apparently it's not. Because if you pour it too fast, then you've got the problem of the saturation and the evenness that comes out of it. So that's a bit of knowing as well. And of course, the final bit is enjoying your coffee. Of course, you must know how to enjoy your coffee. So that's also knowing, if you can argue that way. So thank you for those who have shared on the chat. And what I'm trying to impress upon you is that a simple set of steps here to brew coffee also seemingly involves a number of doing primarily and also the knowing. So herein comes the idea of this notion of supply chain. We talked about the larger scheme of things, the bean being harvested, hulled, dried, packaged, to your retail stores and you purchase it, and to the value chain of preparing a nice coffee involving 8 steps that we just saw. Now, keeping this perspective in mind, this supply chain analogy is not too far off from how we see KM. If you think of a supply chain, for example, as giving a worker the supplies they need to do their work. Take manufacturing, for example. Each worker will need to know how much to do something to add value to the chain, or what to do, when to do, and in the manner that's appropriate. This might mean packing something, inspecting something, anything that he or she does in the chain does add one or more value to the final product or outcome, right? So that is that intention, the premise that I want you to set yourself into. Now, in the same way, if I were to transport you from that analogy of the supply chain we just saw earlier, we can start thinking of KM from the view of a knowledge worker this time, or knowledge worker who seeks knowledge, making sense of it, and distributing it and making it available to others. So the question you may ask is, the person seeks the knowledge, some demand, making sense of it, adding value, and distributing it to others whom he or she feels would also add value. Can you see the chain? So if you think of it in that sense, knowledge management in supply terms, there's always the demand and the supply, right? The question is, what knowledge do the knowledge workers need to be able to make the right decision? That's the first question. Followed by, how can knowledge be supplied efficiently and effectively? Those are two big words, right? A lot of us say, yes, we have conversations because that's very effective. Yes, that's true. But is it efficient? Because if a body of knowledge is to be harnessed, made available enterprise-wide, the conversation you have with a person may be effective, but it may not be efficient because it needs to be effectively distributed. And if that is to take place, knowledge has to be made more explicit in form that is now distributed. So there's always the discussion of how can you make it efficient and effective. And then comes the part where you share, right? How can knowledge be packaged in support of a user and made available to others? Now, I said in support of a user, meaning it's contextualized, and it's relevant, and it's consumable. There's some authors who use the word knowledge nugget. The word nugget here implies the fact that knowledge is consumable, it's relevant. So the big question is, or rather the fundamental question is there a demand? And where's the supply? Sometimes you have a lot of demand and less supply. Sometimes you have a mismatch. You have a lot of supply, but less demand. So that begs a bit of question that I would like us to just reflect on. And I would like you to share your thoughts here on the chat. Looking at what you have observed in your own KM program or KM programs you have observed in other companies. Have you observed a demand supply or supply demand mismatch in your organization, or the ones you've seen and observed? I'm just going to pause here for a moment because that's an important aspect to talk about before we get into the next bit of our discussion. Feel free to share your thoughts in the chat. Now, I will just share one experience before you pen your thoughts down on the chat. An experience that I've had some time back conducting a KM program for, this is the Sporting Institute, by the way. There's a KM program that was meant for coaches some years back, which we did. There were a lot of coaching clinics conducted by the Sports Institute. Specific know-hows were shared to check for injuries. Unfortunately, a lot of thought process went into what sort of instruction go in for warm-up to prevent injury, but not so much specific know-how to check for possible impending injury. And, you know, there was a lot of demand for the first part. I mean, checking for impending injuries, because that's a more proactive stance, as opposed to the kind of warm-ups you can have to prevent injuries. So we had that sort of mismatch. Any other thoughts from anyone? Any experience you've had from where you've come from? Okay, we've got a. Okay, that's interesting, right? Quantum Leapers, you shared lessons learned platform, which we thought had more content than was deemed necessary. Absolutely, and I think that's so true, right? Right. Sometimes you have platforms that it's just inundated with content. Is it relevant? Thank you. Any others? It'd be nice if you can unmute yourself and speak, but unfortunately, that's not possible today. If you could just type on briefly, that would be nice to know your thought process on the demand-supply mismatch that we see happening all the time. Okay, I'm just going to continue. If you do have some thoughts on this, please feel free to share. And I'm going to go on talking about this idea of lean knowledge management. So we're trying to make things lean, aren't we? And here we want to talk about the sweet spot. What is lean management? A lean knowledge management framework is what I want to talk about now. And essentially 4 different parts to it. And it's interesting to see how different components and best practices come together. The first being the idea of the creation of a knowledge backlog. What is a knowledge backlog? Essentially, it is a KM and lean principle combined. We are embedding value. We'll talk about that in a while. What is value? This is followed by a minimal viable KM framework, which is the who, the when, and the how, the plan. Once again, this is a KM and lean principle. And we'll talk about the KM pilot. Just do it, famous Nike slogan, the implementation of it. And the fourth part of the framework, the retrospect, the learning, that the improvement we want to come out of it. Both the third and the fourth components are part and parcel of Agile best practices. So I'm going to go through one by one in a moment, and we will see how this puzzle fits together in a while. And I'm just going to pause for a moment to check if you have any questions up until this point. Feel free to ask any questions you have on the chat at any point. More than happy to pause and take your questions. Okay, so let that come, and I will proceed to the first component of the Lean Knowledge Management Framework, and that is the creation of knowledge backlog. Essentially, the what and the why. The big question is, we are trying to create a backlog from the highest value onwards being the topmost, and the lowest value, the bottommost. So it goes along in that order, the highest value being topmost. This is synonymous to the Agile idea of backlog anyway. If some of you are familiar with this understanding of backlog, in the school of Scrum, Agile practice, we always have this idea called a product backlog, and this is a prioritized list of things to do. But here I'm not using the word priority, I'm using the word value. So that begs the question, how do we determine value? Some argue that value is equivalent to priority, but I will tell you that's much more than that. What comes to mind when you think of value? Can I have some thoughts from everyone here? What do you think of when you think of value? Remember, value is such a big word. What's valuable to one person may or may not be valuable to the other. Absolutely. Ayushi, importance of that particular thing in a particular situation. Yeah, that's very contextualized. Absolutely. Absolutely. Lovely. Impact. Absolutely. Priyasha, the impact it has to the business, organization goals. Absolutely. Needs. Yep. Quantum leapers. Abhishek, the wow effect. Nice. And I like to decompose that, Abhishek. The wow sometimes comes in two parts. You know, it comes as a need and a want. Yeah. So quantum leapers, you mentioned one, and nice. Wow. Okay. Amazing. Ankita, you consider someone or something to be important or beneficial. Yeah. Sometimes it's just the person, right? The stakeholder wanting something so badly, and that becomes a value to that person. And sometimes you've got competing interest, you know, one stakeholder wanting something else that's seemingly important to this person, and the other person having another opposite view of that. That can be a problem. Jane, benefits and usefulness we get from that thing. Absolutely. Again, talking about impact, right? The impact of that to the business. There are others too. I'm sure it's coming from some of you. Things like reputational needs, brand awareness, business urgency, right? Because something may be important but not urgent, right? Something is urgent yet not important. So there are a number of things that shape this idea of value. And it's so, so important that we are so aligned with the understanding of value. And the problem is sometimes this idea of value is only understood by a select few. And I'm saying, say, for example, the knowledge manager understands the understanding of value. What about the team? Do they resonate in the same way? Do they understand what's valuable from the perspective of the organization? And all that you said, the impact, the reputation, the wow effect, the benefits, and so on and so forth, right? So keep in mind, there are loads of workshops that organizations conduct just to understand value, and the fact that sometimes what's valuable today may not be valuable tomorrow. That makes it even more tricky. So this understanding of value is so fluid, it's so dynamic that it needs to be revisited every now and again. So keep that in mind. Excellent. Thank you for your thoughts there. And I'm just going to go on to some tips to share with you. And if you're going to effectively create your knowledge backlog, I typically use these two words. That's much more than two, but I'll typically use these two A's. You're aligning with value, all that you said earlier in the chat, but there should equally be awareness of non-value. And this is an important understanding in lean. And the idea of lean, we increase value by also eliminating some non-value items or activities. So let's talk about this, right? I think the aligning with value, aside from what you have mentioned on the chat earlier, these are some commonly accepted ways, right? We align with business priorities. We align ourselves with the landscape that we are in that keeps changing because we are in a VUCA environment right now. Things will change, the priorities change, it has to be revisited. We align with the goals, objectives, and even stakeholders. And that's one of the hardest parts from my experience in managing KM transformation initiatives. You always have competing stakeholders. And how do you rationalize value with competing interests and wants and needs? That becomes a bit of a challenge, right? And then you have, so these are just the value that you want to amplify. You want to align your work, your knowledge items with these values, with this business needs, with this goals and so on. And then you get into the awareness of non-value. Now, if you know what's taking you away from what's valuable, whether it's the delays, whether it's some poor work practices, whether it is some challenges that is taking you away from what you do. So these are so important because many a times we keep doing what we're doing, not understanding that there are certain things that's holding us back. And I call that those non-value items. So the question is, what other kind of waste can you think of? I just gave a few, but from your experience dealing with your team, dealing with your members of your organization, what other non-value items can you think of? Can you share in the chat? Oh, brilliant. We got one saying mistakes, right? In fact, if you look at the literature in lean production, there are 7 kinds of waste. So I encourage you to have a look at that to understand different kind of waste. Dated knowledge, yes, not relevant. Absolutely. And one common waste I always observe is, you know, when people do something, they just try to just do it themselves, just create whatever they like without looking at whether there is already a template, whether there's a best practices. And what happens is they think they're saving time by just doing it, but they end up reinventing the wheel. They end up making mistakes. There's so much of rework, corrections, rejections. So this causes delay, and delays, it's a waste, right? Anything else? Any other thoughts? Legacy tools, absolutely, right? Tools that probably are not so relevant today. They're not collaborative anymore. In today's day and age, we want tools that are collaborative. Absolutely. And sometimes even approvals, right? We have got excessive number of processes and too many approvals. You find that that's holding us back. And that's also a non-value. So those are the things that you can imagine we should try and reduce or eliminate. Now I'm just going to take you, and anything coming through the chat? Okay, if there are none, I'm just going to walk you through a Mentimeter exercise. And this is an interesting exercise, and I'll share with you what the global finding is from Kunoko in a while. Let me stop share. And if you can use your mobile device, okay, I'm just going to share the screen right now. We're going to do a Mentimeter exercise. Okay, this is pretty much a ranking exercise. If you can see, can you see the code on the top part of the screen? If you click menti.com on your mobile device, your Chrome on your mobile device, and then key in the code 5959359, you will get to this. What I'd like you to do is to rank aspects of KM elements, which you think, in your opinion, is valuable for you. Now, these are some known sets of KM initiatives, but there are some of it could be valuable to you. If it's valuable to you, it's going to be a 1 for you. If it's the least valuable, it's going to be a 10 for you. So you're doing a ranking, right? I'll just give you a couple of minutes to do that. And when you submit, your answer will pop up here. Okay, we've got some answers coming up. Okay, we have some responses here. Just a few more minutes. Okay, another 1 more minute and we can end the poll. Okay, so let's end the poll now. It's interesting. Most of you indicated knowledge retention being your topmost KM value exercise in your company right now. That's interesting. Big data being the lowest. Top three being learning from experience, connecting people through communities and networks. That's nice. So lovely. Thank you for sharing. Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share with you the global survey on the same. So Knoko, we did a survey a couple of years back, and a vast number of companies that were surveyed indicated their top most highest value exercise as far as KM is concerned is connecting people through communities and networks. And the other two and three being improving access, knowledge retention, which also came up as your topmost response. So it's not that far off, big data being the least. But if we're going to do another survey, it's coming up this year. So I would invite you later on, when you have the time, to do a similar survey, and you will have access to that findings as well. So this is as far as value is concerned, but how do we do this from a practical aspect? So I'm just going to show you simple techniques that you can use, leveraging on some ideas from Agile. How do you set up a Trello backlog? Once again, I'm going to stop share and I'm going to share another screen. All right, so I'm just going to show you a screen. So what you can see right now is an example of a tool called Trello. Trello belongs to the Atlassian family of tools. Some of you may be familiar with Jira. So I've chosen Trello for the reason of Trello being a simple tool to use, and it's freely available. So what you see here is a list of value items in what I call the knowledge backlog. So the knowledge backlog is an evolving list of value items. And top of the list, you see connecting people with frameworks, you've got knowledge retention. So remember, at any point, these value items may shift in its priority, meaning it goes higher if the value is higher, right? Relative to the other. So the point I'm trying to make is that managing this backlog is so important in a VUCA environment, right? And we must be very aware and conscious of the fact that this value keeps shifting. So keep that in mind. We'll revisit this understanding of using a backlog, and you can use any other tools for that matter. Microsoft has other tools, you can use other platforms, but the intention is the same, right? You are having a way in which you can visibly now manage, observe, track these value items. So I'm going to stop here for questions. Do you have any questions so far? Okay, so there's no questions. Then I am going to head on to talk about the next bit. So what we just covered was the first part of the framework, that is the creation of the knowledge backlog. And moving forward, we're looking at the next bit, the minimal viable KM framework. Now, how do we do that? And what is that? Now, remember, as we all know it, we have the 4 KM enablers, and this should be common and known to most of you. We have the roles and responsibility that's required for any KM initiatives. That includes if you have a community of practice leaders, knowledge managers, you have knowledge owners. You also have the process elements, whether it's your after action review, whether it's your knowledge capture, your knowledge asset creation, and so on. Or it could be your technology elements, like the tool I just showed you, Trello, you have apps, your portals, your collaboration tools, your search engines. I know some organizations, they have lesson management systems. That could be some of your technology elements. And you have your governance elements, right? Your expectations of policy, metrics, incentives, reward recognitions, different formats, taxonomies, your protocol, your support systems. So these are the KM enablers, and we know it, and that's important. So the question I have before I get into how these enablers come into shape, I have this next poll for you. And once again, I invite you to use menti.com. If you can once again use that. I'm going to take you to the next poll. So looking at these 4 elements that you're familiar with, which of these 4 KM enablers needs enhancement? We know that they are not optional for any KM initiatives to tick. You need them in totality. But my question is, do you see a lag in one or more areas? So you can select more than one, in fact. Okay, some of you have shared. Okay, more responses coming up. Okay, another 1 more minute. Okay, just gonna stop share. And it's interesting to note that there is a almost equivalent response on the importance of roles and responsibilities with technology. And you see, the question is, if you look at roles and responsibilities, they're never enough, right? And even if you look at technology, it's never going to be enough. The question is, how much is enough? And that brings me to the next part of our presentation. To talk about that. So we're moving on to the next part of the framework. How much is enough? So I'm calling this a minimal viable KM framework because all you need to do is to decide which aspect of the KM or knowledge backlog you're going to start working on. So if, for instance, my focus is on the topmost value in the backlog, and that you will see in that flickering square box there, connecting people through communities and network. If I see that to be the highest importance for me right now in the company, and this is so urgent, so important, it brings the most value, all I need to do is I need to scaffold a set of roles and responsibility, process, technology, and governance elements just sufficiently enough to do this. And if you do that, you are doing what I call as a minimal viable KM framework, right? It's minimal, sufficient to do what you need to do, right? That's the idea. Does that make sense? Can I just check on the chat? Does that make sense to you? There's always so many people you can involve. There's always so many process elements you can have. There's so much of technology that you can adopt and implement. But all I'm saying is you just need to have that minimum amount of these four to do what you need to do right now, right? And that is the minimal viable KM framework. So what that means is you are looking at, say, for example, if I were to talk about one example of a project that I was involved in, and this is a setup where they wanted to manage grants. And in this example that I'd like to share with you, there was a need to have a community of practice for grant management because there were people who were quite good at it. There were others who were not. And the people side would be the researchers and the academics and so on. And the processes they needed was just whatever you need, whether it's the articulation of the ideas, funding, proposal, application, and so on. And you've got the tools sufficient to manage this. They use a combination of Teams for the communication side. They use Trello for the collaboration side. They use the portal, which they already had, to upload certain resources and to make it available to the rest. And minimal set of policy to guide the whole process, as in what is the reward, recognition system, and the code of conduct that needs to happen. So here's an example of what I call as the minimal viable KM framework. In this example, I used a grant management KM initiative for this particular setup. So keeping that in mind, that is the framework number 2, right? So let's move on to the third framework. We just did the first one, knowledge backlog. We did the second one, minimal KM framework. And the third one I'm going to talk about is the KM pilot. So that's the third framework, right? So what is the KM pilot all about? So again, you are piloting the minimal KM framework in one or more areas. And the choice is yours. Remember, the duration of your engagement can be ongoing if it's an operation type setup. If it's a project, then you've got a fixed date. Your reporting cycle, how soon do you get back with outcome? Could be as minimal as 2 weeks, at most 4 weeks. Now, why is this the range of 2 to 4? Because you don't want to spend too much time and then knowing you've expended so much time, effort, and energy, but it was not worth it. So if you keep your time cycle or your reporting cycle shorter, you have better opportunity for feedback and improvement. And areas impacted, this understanding who is your stakeholder and how they impacted. And remember, the deliverables are so important and they must be clearly quantified. And other matrices I would recommend is to embed some form of reward or recognition. Now, even if a reward is not possible, do always emphasize on some form of recognition. That's so very important. Now, still going on the example I shared earlier, a project that we were involved. Once again, we're talking about grant management. In this case, the objective was to disseminate best practices in sourcing, securing, implementing new and ongoing internal and external grants. The duration is ongoing. Well, grants keep coming up, the different windows, so it's ongoing. But the reporting cycle is every 4 weeks. So the team that's involved in the COP, they are going to come back every 4 weeks and report something, right? And what are they going to report? Again, based on the key deliverables. You've got all the elements, whether it's a colloquium they need to organize, whether it's a one-on-one consultation, whether it's monthly staff highlights, expert sharing, or live Q&As. And then remember, you've got the other deliverables. You've got number of sharing sessions, grant proposals, and so on and so forth. So remember that the piloting exercise is so important because it's a framework, a boundary that you're establishing with very clear outcomes that can be reported, that can be measured, and that can be known whether it works or not. The last part of the framework is the retrospect in itself. So while this is not new, we have been doing retrospect for a long time. But the question is, what sort of improvement comes out of the retrospect? And that's important to know. So first and foremost, what is a retrospect, right? In very simple terms, it's a team-based technique to learn and improve, right? It's a team-based technique. You typically have someone to lead it. And why? You reflect, you learn, and accept. Now, I use the word accept because the change process doesn't happen if there is no realization, acceptance of what has transpired. And keep in mind, a retrospect can only take place when you finish a cycle, right? And I said, if your cycle is 2 weeks, if you remember what I'm talking about cycle, remember, you've got your reporting cycle. If your reporting cycle is 4 weeks, you've got retrospective every 4 weeks. If your reporting cycle is 2 weeks, then you've got your retrospect every 2 weeks. So it's how long your cycle determines how frequent your retrospective will be. Now, who does it? In a typical KM environment, you've got the knowledge manager, the team lead, or in an agile environment, you talk about the Scrum Master leading it. And how do we do it? How do we do retrospect? And for some of you who may have done this in the past, they're very simple questions, right? The questions like, what went well, for instance? You know, basically you're saying successes and things people are proud about from a technical or teamwork aspect. What went less well? For example, areas of improvement, are there gaps in processes or misalignment? What do we do or what we want to try next? It could be perspectives moving forward, areas they want to solve as a team, and what puzzles us. I mean, these are potential issues, challenges, hurdles, barriers that should be addressed moving forward. So remember, this retrospect is only for that cycle, right? So if I were to take the same example, right, we had the same community practice for grant management. So what went well? Everybody loved the Q&As. They thought it was great. We had spotlights because we were appreciating team members. So they liked that sort of recognition that was provided for them and to them. And what went less well? Well, they felt that having a colloquium every 4 weeks was a bit of a stress for the team because that meant organizing an event. Even if it's a virtual event, it took a lot of time away from their work. So they didn't quite like that. So they were suggesting to do that every quarter, for example. What do you want to do next? A walkthrough of each section of the grant application would be great because instead of just giving them sample grants, they were saying, can we get those experts who have done successfully, can we have them walk through us step by step, question by question? That was good. So that was something that they wanted to do different the next time around. And what puzzles us that, this is something that, these are challenges, right? And, they found researchers uh, chose to email the research office without going to the FAQ. It's all there, but people just like to ask questions and not check if there is already an answer for that. And of course, some team members were not participating, they were quite passive. So what comes out of this is that, it's such a powerful technique. And I wanted to just very quickly, in the time we have now, if you can just put it on the chat, what is your one event or project or activity you have completed quite recently that you think a retrospect might be good? What would that be? Just reflect now, right now. You have been in a project, or you are currently already done or did something, could be last year, last month, 2 months back. What is it that you would like to reflect or retrospect? Now, I'll just probably share one experience I've had with one company that we were involved recently. This is a company that did a 5G rollout, and they did in phases. And in the first phase, what they saw was there is certainly a lot of room for improvement. And when I hosted a section on this, they found a lot of insights. So you gather a lot of lessons learned from a retrospect exercise, right? That's the intention. Any others? Any examples of anyone, any project you recently did that you think a retrospect might be a good idea? Okay, Jen, a major migration of an old knowledge tool to a new instance. Wow, that's a big one. Absolutely. Especially when you have people who are accustomed to the old tool, moving to a new tool, plenty of insights, plenty of learnings. Iqbal, my colleague from Kunoko, Indonesia. Junior Consultant Development Program, interesting. I presume that was done, and there is some retrospect out of that. Ayushi, migration from old SharePoint to the new SharePoint Online, absolutely, that's a big one. Loads of things to learn, lots of aspects to learn. And now just to share with you, even though I didn't touch on this quite a bit in my presentation, usually the retrospect happens at 4 levels, right? And I'm going to put that on the chat. I usually talk about the 4 Ps, okay? The 4 Ps, I put that on the chat. So what is that 4P all about? Usually we retrospect at 4 levels, right? You got the people side, you got the process aspect, you retrospect also on the project side, if you're doing it on a project basis, or you can retrospect how things went operationally speaking. And finally, of course, the product or outcome. So when you do retrospect, try to see if you can address some of these different dimensions, because sometimes the issue could be with the people, right? So if it's the team, then it's a retrospect. If it's that person, that one person, then I would call it an introspect. Okay, unfortunately, we don't have the time to do an introspect right now, but have a read on that. You could do a retrospect, or you could do an introspect. So retrospect is for the team, introspect is for that person, specifically to improve himself or herself. And of course, you've got the process aspect. Remember, we talked about waste, we talked about lean earlier. That things that you're doing is taking away valuable time, it's inefficient, there's a lot of waste, there's a lot of time, delays, approvals, then it's a process issue, right? You want to address that separately. And then, of course, you've got your project operation aspects, whether you manage your timelines, how do you manage your different outcomes, your measurement of your deliverables, and of course, the final part would be your outcome. All right. Results don't lie, they say, right? If your results is not up to expectation, that itself calls for a retrospect. Absolutely. So remember, a retrospect is only as good if you do something about it. If it's all on paper, like what you see here, then it's quite pointless, right? So what's next? I'm in the last couple of slides of my presentation. And the last part of the presentation is how do you put all this together? How do you implement this framework? Right? So that is exactly what I want to share with you. Right? So the first part is, like I've shared earlier on, you've got your knowledge backlog. You need to have your list. You need to have your list in terms of priority of value. Once you've got that, then you do or come up with your minimal viable KM framework, sorry. And that minimal viable KM framework is not too extensive. It's sufficient to do what you want to do right now. Remember, we're not doing something enterprise-wide. We're only doing something that you want to do right now. And you will then do a pilot for that, and you do retrospect, and the retrospect will feed in to your backlog. And it's quite unlikely that you might be able to do one item in 4 weeks. So very often, especially if it takes time, it's rollout, it's having access to a portal, it might take a number of iterations, and that's fine. And the idea is you keep learning from every iteration. Your retrospect has to be such that the learning happens continuously, and that's the intention, right? So once you keep doing that over time, and then you can move on to other areas of your backlog. And once again, the learning continues. And if that's over after some time, then you move on to the next item in your knowledge backlog. So over time, what happens is you start to see success, celebrate success, and success breeds success. Of course, there'll be issues along the way. There will be pitfalls, and that's why the learning has to be profound. All right. So on that note, to recap what we've covered today, we have, in short, covered the thought process behind the lean knowledge management. There's so much in this, but we have covered the essence of it. And I've showed you the 4 different quadrants of lean knowledge management framework. Namely, you have the knowledge backlog, you have the minimal viable KM framework, and then you have the KM pilot, and lastly, the retrospective. The retrospect is the learning process that takes place. And the final bit, the implementation side, is the part where you continuously, iteratively keep going, improving in a lean approach. I will end my session by saying, with this closing remark, and I would say if you implement the lean knowledge management framework effectively, with some guidance, of course, I would say you will optimize your KM initiative and experience immediate returns. On that note, I end my presentation and I hand over the session to Alec.
Thank you, Sanath. That's a great session. It brings us to the conclusion. We're slightly ahead of time, actually. We're about 15 minutes early, so we have opportunity that there are questions. You're welcome to type them into the chat. But I really like I very much like the interactive polls. I think that was great. And it's great to see so many people coming from different parts of the world. It's really is an international event today.
Absolutely.
Just having a look in the chat. So feel free to put questions. Otherwise, our next session is going to be starting shortly. We've got about 14 minutes, I think, exactly. It starts at 7, no, sorry, little longer. It starts at 7:10 India time, which is Narrative as Knowledge. This is by Elmi Bester from Cultivating Company. So, Sana, I think that brings us to the end. I don't think there's any further questions. Just having a quick look in the chat. Oh, Jean has the hand up. There's questions coming in. So one from Jean. What advice would you give teams that are just starting to implement lean knowledge management in their retrospective process? What are some of the challenges they are likely to face, and how can they overcome them?
Yeah, so what I would say to begin with is to start on an area in your knowledge backlog that you know you have the most chance to succeed. And remember, I said earlier, success breeds success, right? And when I say when you have the most chance, you know you have the right people to get going, you've got the right resource, then you've got the right infrastructure, and you probably want to put in place some minimal set of governance and get that going first. And once you do that, you know you have the confidence because these are the ones you know you trust can get the job done. And once the result is out and you see and you start to evolve and you get your retrospect going, you find that down the line, people might revert back to the old way of doing things, right? And that's why you got to be very vigilant. For example, I would say having a retrospect in itself is a good thing to have, right? And a lot of times I've seen in my coaching sessions, especially in Agile, I have noticed that people don't do retrospect that well. And that's a huge, huge wasted opportunity for improvement. So do pay attention in your retrospect because that's where you get a lot of ground feedback and issues that teams face and consciously try to address one after the other. That's the best advice I can give you, Jane.
Thank you. I'll just give it a few more minutes. Oh, just a reminder. Also, we have after each session we have the feedback poll. As always, we always love to get feedback from our sessions. So, thank you everyone for completing that. Okay, thank you. So, Sana, that was great. Thank you very much again, and hopefully you'll be staying around for the other sessions during the day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having me.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks.